Mario Kart is more successful than it has any right to be. More successful than regular Mario games, in fact. On the Switch, Super Mario Odyssey has sold 29 million copies, but Mario Kart 8 has sold 67 million. And it's the same on almost every Nintendo console. Mario Kart games nearly always sell far more copies than actual Mario platformers. So then, what's the secret to Mario Kart's huge success? Well, today I want to travel back to the beginning of the series and work our way forward. We're going to look at how every single Mario Kart game was created, to understand how these kart racing titles became so darn successful. Here's how Mario Kart became Nintendo's biggest franchise. Part 1. Super Mario Kart. There's 3 people who are really important to know about when you talk about Mario Kart's history. The first is Shigeru Miyamoto, the man who created Mario and Zelda. And around 1990, he made a request to 2 other people within Nintendo, Hideki Kono and Tadashi Sugiyama. Both Kono and Sugiyama were game designers at the company who'd worked there for about 5 or 6 years at the time. And Shigeru Miyamoto came to the duo with a suggestion. What if they made a 2-player racing game, similar to F-Zero? F-Zero was Nintendo's first big racing game, and it was all about speed, about going as fast as you possibly could. It was also a single-player game, and so if Hideki Kono and Tadashi Sugiyama were going to make a 2-player version of it, they'd have to make some big changes. Here's a map of one of F-Zero's racecourses, and now I'm going to lay a map of a Mario Kart racecourse on top of it. Just look at the massive difference in size here. That size difference is because of technical limitations. F-Zero pulls off its huge courses by switching between lots of smaller pieces of track as you drive. But because Mario Kart would have to render 2 different points of view, one for each player, it couldn't switch between maps on the fly. Instead, the game's designers had to cram in an entire racecourse into a 1024 by 1024 pixel box. So, because the courses would be smaller, Kono and Sugiyama slowed down the speed of the vehicles, in the process changing them from race cars to go-karts. And because each of the game's courses were laid out on the exact same square, the racetracks would twist and turn around themselves, again making them feel less like racing courses and more like go-kart tracks. And so it was decided, Kono and Sugiyama's racing game would be a go-kart racing game. Not long after that, Hideki Kono asked the game's producer, Shigeru Miyamoto, to let the whole team spend a day at a local amusement park to try driving real go-karts. Miyamoto replied, "Why, can't you tell what they're like without driving them?" But he eventually gave in, and the game's development team got to spend the day at a local park called Nemu no Sato, where they tried driving real go-karts. While they were there, the game's sound designer, Taro Bando, even recorded the sounds of the karts, which you can hear in the final game. After returning to HQ, some members of the game's development team also tried building a big remote-controlled go-kart, which they drove around Nintendo's offices. Unfortunately, when they passed the remote control to Super Mario Kart's main programmer, Masato Kimura, he crashed the go-kart into a wall 5 seconds after trying it, and the kart was, in the words of Hideki Kono, pulverized. Now, for the first 3 to 4 months of development, the characters driving the go-karts were completely generic. "Early on, we had young men in overalls driving the karts," said Kono. "We put helmets on them and used different colours to differentiate between them," added Tadashi Sugiyama. "But looking from behind, we couldn't tell who was who." The pair began to wonder, what if there was a character who was recognizable even from behind? They landed on Mario. So, after about a year of development, and with only 8 staff members, Super Mario Kart was finally complete. The game proved to be wildly successful, selling almost 9 million copies and becoming the 4th best-selling game on the SNES. But Super Mario Kart was just the beginning. Part 2: Mario Kart 64. With Super Mario Kart a big success, and with Nintendo working on their next big console, the Nintendo 64, it only made sense to start work on a new Mario Kart game. This new game's development team was largely the same as before, with Shigeru Miyamoto producing and Hideki Kono directing. Tadashi Sugiyama also worked on the game, but this time focusing on the graphics. The initial plan was for this new Mario Kart game to launch alongside the Nintendo 64, just like Super Mario 64. But near the end of development, Shigeru Miyamoto stole a bunch of the developers from the Mario Kart team to help him get Mario 64 done on time. Now, the Nintendo 64's biggest strength as a console was 3D gaming. The SNES wasn't designed with 3D graphics in mind, so the original Super Mario Kart used tricks to simulate 3D visuals. But the Nintendo 64 was different. It was designed squarely with 3D graphics in mind, which meant that this new Mario Kart would have a whole new dimension to play with. But that also caused a whole new dimension of difficulty for the development staff. The biggest difference from the Super NES game was the 3D graphics, said Hideki Kono. At the time, I didn't know much about 3D imaging, so I had a very hard time. But to make matters even harder, producer Shigeru Miyamoto gave the developers a really challenging goal: 4-player races. Shigeru Miyamoto said in an interview, "The N64 CPU is quite fast, and doing those kinds of calculations is one of its specialities. But even so, at first the programmers said, 'This is impossible.' And to pull off those 4-player races, the development staff had to make use of some really clever tricks. The biggest of all being the fact that none of the karts or drivers in the game are really 3D at all. Instead, the characters were modelled in 3D and then rendered into flat images at a bunch of different angles. Then, in the game, you display one of these flat images on screen and the character looks like they're 3D. If the character turns left, you just switch out the image on screen, with the image you have of them facing left. This technique is called billboarding, and without it, Mario Kart 64 could never have supported 4-player races. The Nintendo 64 just couldn't have displayed that many complicated 3D characters on screen at once. Really, Mario Kart 64 isn't a dramatically different game from its predecessor, which is something the team worried about. We really did struggle to find ways to differentiate this game from Super Mario Kart, said Tadashi Sugiyama. The biggest difference this time round was the 3D courses. In the original Super Mario Kart, the courses were just flat images tilted at an angle to give the illusion of 3D. The game's lead programmer, Masato Kimura, described it as like everyone is racing on a flat sheet of paper. But with this game, Nintendo's designers were able to create fully 3D courses with troughs and valleys and hills for the player to ride around. This created much more difficult physics calculations for the programmers, but as a matter of pride, they refused to deny any requests from the designers when it came to complicated course layouts. These intricate racetracks were one of the key ways the game's developers hoped Mario Kart 64 would stand out from its predecessor. Near the end of development, though, a disaster happened. The computer which stored all of the rendered images of the characters crashed. And according to programmer Tomoaki Kurome, all of our work got erased. Of course, we had backups, but not everything could be recovered. We had no choice but to remake everything from scratch. So, in the end, about 80% of the character models ended up getting made twice. But I think the remakes turned out better than the originals, so I guess it was a blessing in disguise. So, despite this setback, and despite Shigeru Miyamoto borrowing a lot of the game's developers so he could get Mario 64 done on schedule, Mario Kart 64 was finished only 6 months after the Nintendo 64 came out. And just like Super Mario Kart, it ended up becoming one of the best-selling games on the console, second only to Super Mario 64. Which finally settled it. Super Mario Kart was no fluke. Mario Kart as a series was wildly popular with fans, which meant it was only onwards from here. Part 3. Mario Kart Super Circuit. 5 years passed. That's right, despite Mario Kart 64's huge success, Nintendo didn't release another Mario Kart game for 5 years. But then, in 2001, Nintendo launched 2 brand new game consoles, the Game Boy Advance and the GameCube. And so, Nintendo took on the ambitious challenge of developing a new Mario Kart game for each console. Nintendo's own developers began work on what would later become Mario Kart Double Dash for the GameCube. And for the other Mario Kart game, Nintendo decided to have an outside studio take on development. They picked Intelligent Systems, the developer behind Fire Emblem, WarioWare, and Paper Mario. Nintendo had been working closely with Intelligent Systems for many years. At the time, Intelligent Systems offices were even located inside Nintendo's headquarters. Now, the Game Boy Advance was not a console designed for 3D gaming. When they announced the console, Nintendo even said right off the bat that the GBA was designed with 2D games in mind. In its later years, some third-party developers did manage to get 3D graphics up and running, but complicated 3D graphics were practically impossible on the GBA at the time of Mario Kart Super Circuit's development. Instead, Intelligent Systems went with a pseudo-3D approach, similar to the original Super Mario Kart. That meant flat 2D courses tilted at an angle. In fact, Super Circuit's pseudo-3D engine had so much in common with the original Super Mario Karts that Intelligent Systems decided to include every racetrack from the original game as a bonus for players. And when the game was released alongside the Game Boy Advance, it proved an immediate hit, with sales eventually reaching almost 6 million units, making it the 4th best-selling game on the GBA, beating any other Mario game. But as Super Circuit was taking shape, a team inside Nintendo was beginning work on an even bigger and more ambitious Mario Kart game. Part 4. Mario Kart Double Dash. Now, the Game Boy Advance was not the only console Nintendo was developing in 2001. They had a brand new home console in the works too. It was to be far more powerful than Nintendo's previous console, and it would be called the GameCube. During E3 2001, Nintendo showed off a Mario Kart demo to the public. However, it was extremely bare bones and featured assets taken from other games. Behind the scenes, development had only just begun. And since the regular director, Hideki Kono, was busy at the time, a new director was brought in called Kiyoshi Mizuki. Now, Kiyoshi Mizuki had never worked on a Mario Kart game before, but he got stuck right in with perhaps the biggest game in the Mario Kart series so far. You see, thanks to the GameCube's processing power, Nintendo was able to finally implement fully 3D characters and karts, rather than the various pseudo-3D techniques that previous games had used. But the hardest problem for the game's director had nothing to do with the graphics. It was deciding on what unique new gameplay idea the game should feature. They needed to please hardcore Mario Kart fans while also attracting brand new players. Mizuki joked in an interview that he would often stay for an hour or so in the bathroom, stressing about these new gameplay features, and said that it was a very difficult task. Eventually, the idea was suggested of 2 players riding in a single go-kart. And right away, this fulfilled a lot of Mizuki's requirements. It would transform the game into more of a party game, letting players of all skill levels take part. If someone wasn't super great at controlling the kart, then they could focus on hitting other players with items instead. But not everyone on the team liked these 2-player karts. There were many heated discussions, as Kiyoshi Mizuki put it, and it wasn't clear up until the last minute whether these 2-player karts would even make it into the game. Another point that came up during development was multiplayer. By Double Dash's release in 2003, the internet was becoming more and more mainstream. In interviews with press leading up to the game's release, Nintendo staff were asked many times about whether Double Dash would allow players to compete against other players via the internet. The answer was no. Tadashi Sugiyama, who was at this point working as a producer, said, "One of the most asked questions is about the online feature. That kind of online feature was not included in this game, but may be something that we tackle in future Mario Kart games." The omission was more of a technical limitation than a conscious gameplay decision. According to Shinya Takahashi, who now leads all of Nintendo's game development, the Double Dash team didn't believe that internet infrastructure of the time could support the game's high-speed races or battles. He promised that in future, if internet speeds improved, they would revisit the idea of online Mario Kart. Instead, the development team introduced an alternative, LAN connection. By connecting multiple GameCubes together with LAN adapters, up to 8 players could compete in races and 16 players in battle mode. It's a pretty neat way to race against large numbers of people, but whether it fills the gap of online racing, I'll leave that up to you to decide. And so, in late 2003, Mario Kart Double Dash was released for the Nintendo GameCube. It was, at the time, the most unique Mario Kart game Nintendo had developed. It probably still is, in fact. Tadashi Sugiyama said in an interview, "We have been able to put everything we wanted into the game. We left some things out when we finished Mario Kart for the N64, but all these features are now included in Double Dash." But there was one major omission that came up time and time again in interviews, online racing. So, for the next Mario Kart entry, this would be something that Nintendo's developers would face head-on. Part 5. Mario Kart DS. Series co-creator Hideki Kono had been preoccupied during Double Dash's development, and so had little impact on the title. But with Nintendo's next handheld console, the DS, in the works, it was time for a new Mario Kart game to enter development. And around this time, Hideki Kono returned to the reins as producer of 2 games. You see, Shigeru Miyamoto personally asked Kono to oversee both Mario Kart DS and also Nintendogs, with the 2 titles in development at the same time. Kono said in an interview, "I would say to myself, okay, today is a Mario Kart DS day, and tomorrow is a Nintendogs day, but sometimes the director of Mario Kart DS would want to meet on a Nintendogs day. I'd have him wait until evening, and then, after I'd driven all the dogs out of my head, we'd sit down and talk." One of the main goals the team had this time round was playing with friends. Using the DS's wireless local connection feature, up to 8 people could race against each other. Plus, thanks to download play, only a single cartridge was needed for the whole group to join. Pretty neat. But Right near the end of the game's development, Kono and his team decided to set themselves a huge challenge. They wanted to add online racing, which had been left out of Double Dash before. Hideki Kono, along with company president Satoru Iwata, travelled to the US headquarters of Nintendo of America to see what the American staff thought of the idea. The response was so great that we soon began working on it in earnest, said Kono. It was all very last minute, with the team having to pare the online mode down to its most basic set of features. Only 4 racers, no leaderboards, no sharing ghost data online. But crucially, the team managed to get the online mode working for the game's late 2005 release date. This was the first online mode in a DS game, let alone the Mario Kart series. And so all of the team should have been very happy with how things turned out. Except one person wasn't. President Iwata reminisced to Hideki Kono. "Kono-san, I remember how frustrated you looked. At a meeting you had this completely unsatisfied look on your face. Having to cut all of those additional online features was extremely frustrating for Kono. He made up his mind that for their next Mario Kart game, all of his online mode dreams would become reality." Part 6. Mario Kart Wii. Development on a new Mario Kart title for Nintendo's upcoming Wii console began in 2006, and while previous games had differentiated themselves with unique game mechanics, like Double Dash's dual rider system, for instance, producer Hideki Kono had a new trick up his sleeve this time round. He wanted to use the Nintendo Wii's motion controls to make this game approachable to those who'd never played a video game in their lives. He said in an interview, "When we made Mario Kart DS, my parents tried to play it together with their grandchild, but it was difficult for them to use the control pad. They were saying, 'This is hard.' So, for Mario Kart Wii, Kono wanted to remove the need to use D-pads or analog sticks in favour of something that felt natural to almost everyone, using a steering wheel. So, in late 2006, Kono reached out to Nintendo's hardware development team with the suggestion of creating some kind of steering wheel peripheral for the Wii remote. Miyamoto was also on board with the idea, saying, "I kind of wanted to make a product that would come in a big box for a change." The hardware team developed numerous prototypes throughout 2007. This is one of the earliest Wii wheel prototypes, where the corners of the Wii remote actually stick out a little. In later attempts, the whole remote was covered, but the wheel became less of a circle and more of a squashed rectangle. According to Kenichiro Ashida of the Product Development Division, "We checked out some real go-kart wheels and saw that they're usually square steering wheels today, rather than round ones." However, eventually Ashida and his team came to the conclusion that a round wheel is what the everyday person is used to. And so, after a number of revisions, the final design of the Wii wheel was landed upon. The Mario Kart dev team felt so strongly that the wheel was an important part of Mario Kart Wii that they put it on the front of the game box. But there was another big innovation introduced in Mario Kart Wii, which also came from the mind of producer Hideki Kono. He said in an interview, "I love BMX bicycles and snowboarding. When we made the game for the DS, we wanted to put in some elements of extreme sports, but it was difficult to achieve in a handheld game. That's why we decided to make it happen for the Wii." This extreme sports influence led to the introduction of half-pipes in many of the game's tracks, along with motorbikes. Previously, Miyamoto had vetoed the idea, saying he thought it would be strange to see Mario riding a bike. But this time round, he gave his approval. The team even planned on calling the game Mario Kart X after extreme sports. But Super Smash Bros. Developer Masahiro Sakurai beat them to the punch with Super Smash Bros. Brawl's Japanese title, Super Smash Bros. X. And then finally, there was the online mode. Born from Hideki Kono's frustration with the limited online options in Mario Kart DS, the team developed a whole range of online modes and features for Mario Kart Wii. Standard races could be played with a full 12 players from across the globe, and friends were able to drop into lobbies their friends were in. There were also time trial rankings and ghost data from players across the globe. Mario Kart Wii really embraced all of the online features at the team's disposal. Thanks to the Mario Kart channel on the Wii, you could even see if your friends were playing without the Mario Kart game disc in your console. Mario Kart Wii went on to sell a whopping 37 million copies, making it the second best-selling Wii game behind only Wii Sports. The team was able to take a couple-year break from Mario Kart after the game's 2008 release. But when it came time to develop the next Mario Kart entry, the game's developers would face an altogether different kind of problem to any they'd faced before. Part 7. Mario Kart 7. Development on a new Mario Kart entry for Nintendo's upcoming handheld, the 3DS, began in 2010. This time, Kosuke Yabuki, a game designer who worked on Mario Kart Wii, was promoted to director. And from the start, Yabuki knew he wanted to mix up the traditional Mario Kart gameplay. He modified Mario Kart Wii so that the karts could fly through the air. He also tried making them feel floaty and light, telling producer Hideki Kono, "Doesn't it look like they're underwater? Wouldn't it be fun to drive underwater?" And so, Yabuki led a tiny team of 8 developers to begin building a prototype for this new Mario Kart game. But while development was getting off to a good start, the team would soon run into a pretty huge problem. They had no more developers to work on the game. You see, at the same time, Nintendogs and Cats was also in early production, and of the 2 3DS titles, it was Nintendogs which was prioritized. According to Hideki Kono, when we got to the stage where we'd really be getting down to business on Mario Kart 7, lots of titles were underway in the department, and we had a problem. We didn't have enough members to develop the game. Kono began discussing this problem with some of the other high-level staff at Nintendo, including President Satoru Iwata and producer of the Metroid Prime series, Kensuke Tanabe. Tanabe's role at the company was to coordinate development with external game studios, including Texas-based Retro Studios. Retro Studios were the ones behind the Metroid Prime trilogy, and at the time, work was just finishing on Donkey Kong Country Returns. Kono said in an interview, the timing when they were going to be wrapped up with Donkey Kong Country Returns matched the timing we would start needing help. The timing was right, and we ended up making it happen. And so began an international partnership to bring the next Mario Kart title to life. That December, a group of developers from the Texas-based studio were flown out to Japan to meet producer Hideki Kono, director Kosuke Yabuki, and the rest of the Mario Kart team at Nintendo. While initially the two groups felt a little distant, it was during a dinner at a yakiniku restaurant that the barriers were broken down. After returning to the US, Retro's staff held weekly video calls with the Mario Kart devs in Japan. It was decided that half the courses would be created by Retro and half by Nintendo in Japan. This way, each group could learn new approaches and take inspiration from the work of the other studio. It helped that Retro's devs were all big Mario Kart fans. Kono stated, they were very, very knowledgeable about Mario Kart. During one video call, slow internet meant that Retro were the only ones who could hear the other studio's audio. Nintendo's Japanese staff were impressed when Retro continued the call using hand gestures alone. And so, after an international collaboration between Kyoto and Texas, Mario Kart 7 was released for the 3DS in 2011, becoming the best-selling game on the system. The Mario Kart team and Retro Studios parted ways shortly afterwards, with Retro developing a sequel to Donkey Kong Country Returns, the critically acclaimed Tropical Freeze. Meanwhile, the Mario Kart devs in Japan began work on the most ambitious and best-selling game in the series' history. Part 8: Mario Kart 8. It was at the start of the 2010s that Nintendo began developing their newest home console, the Wii U. Along with the inclusion of a second screen, this would be Nintendo's first HD game console. And once work finished up on Mario Kart 7, director Kosuke Yabuki and producer Hideki Kono began brainstorming ideas for the next entry in the series. They knew they needed to again surprise players by bringing something new to the table, but what? They'd already gone into the skies and underwater. Where else? Their first idea was to attach drills to the front of the karts and have them dig underground. Subterranean racing is how Hideki Kono described it. But it didn't take long for this idea to fall by the wayside, in favour of a more exciting, and frankly, more fun game mechanic: anti-gravity driving. What if courses could snake onto walls, or even upside down? The team's first idea to utilise anti-gravity driving was a Mobius strip. If you cut a ring of paper and twist one half around before attaching the ends together, you have a loop of paper where the front and back connect as one long loop. A racetrack in the shape of this Mobius strip would be the perfect showcase for the game's new anti-gravity mechanic. And this twisted loop looked a lot like the number 8, which inspired the game's title and logo. And so, with the concept decided on, it was time to enter development in full. According to Yabuki, the core team of developers was the same as those who'd worked on the previous entry, Mario Kart 7, albeit only the Japanese side of the team. But, like I mentioned, the Wii U was Nintendo's first HD console, and across the company, Nintendo's developers found working in HD considerably more difficult than expected. According to Shigeru Miyamoto, we may have underestimated the scale of the change to HD development, and as a result, the overall software development took more time than originally anticipated. To keep development on track, it was decided to once again bring on an external studio to help out, this time Bandai Namco. Unlike the fairly equal partnership with Retro Studios, Bandai Namco were very much a support studio on Mario Kart 8, with Nintendo's internal staff making the major creative decisions. According to Bandai Namco's own website, we produced approximately half of visual assets for courses, characters, and machine parts. Bandai Namco's involvement was crucial in getting the game out on time and to a high level of polish. And so, in early 2014, Mario Kart 8 was released for the Wii U. It received glowing reviews which praised its fantastic visuals and music, along with the exciting new anti-gravity filled courses. On the Wii U, the game sold 8.5 million copies, which means that over 60% of Wii U owners picked up a copy of Mario Kart 8. That's an impressive statistic. But it wasn't on Wii U where the game hit its stride, as it were. No, Mario Kart 8's true success lay just around the corner. Part 8.5: Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Mario Kart Tour, Mario Kart Live Home Circuit. So, I've now covered all of the mainline Mario Kart games from the SNES up until the Wii U, but those 8 games are only the tip of the iceberg. First of all, there's Mario Kart's arcade offerings, Mario Kart Arcade GP from 2005, along with 3 sequels released in 2007, 2013, and 2017. These games were developed by Bandai Namco, though not the same part of the company that worked on Mario Kart 8. Hideki Kono explained, We wanted them to have a free hand when they made it. We wanted them to have their own vision, and so we told them to go ahead, go do that on your own. The lack of involvement from Nintendo explains these games' unique vibe, plus the inclusion of non-Nintendo characters like Pac-Man. Then we have the best-selling game in the entire Mario Kart series, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. According to the game's producer, Kosuke Yabuki, he felt that the Switch would be perfect for Mario Kart, thanks to its dual controllers, which make local multiplayer a breeze. And so, not wanting to waste any time before bringing a Mario Kart title to the system, the team made the decision to bring an updated version of Mario Kart 8 to the new console, rather than develop a new title from the ground up. This approach proved wildly successful, with the game's sales at 67 million and still growing as I make this video. In 2022, when Yabuki was asked whether he'd foreseen the game's monumental success, the producer replied, "We didn't, but in hindsight, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is a good match for the Switch. You can play the console anywhere and even split the controller in two, so it's easy to pick up and play with a nearby sibling or friend. 5 years after the game's release, that appeal hasn't faded." Then, in 2019, the company released Mario Kart Tour, a Mario Kart game that can be played on mobile phones. Like Mario Kart 8 before it, the game was developed in partnership with Bandai Namco, who state on their website, "We partially implemented in-game and 3D visual assets for courses, characters, and machines. We also produced approximately half of bonus challenges." It's not clear how involved the core Mario Kart team were in Mario Kart Tour's development, but despite the game's mixed reviews, it went on to receive over 200 million downloads. And then, in 2020, Nintendo released another new Mario Kart game, Mario Kart Live Home Circuit for the Switch, which puts the classic Mario Kart action in your own living room, thanks to a small remote control car carrying a camera. The game got its start when New York-based Velan Studios experimented with the idea of some kind of mixed reality kart racing game. They instantly thought of Mario Kart and put together a prototype which they brought to Nintendo. Impressed, Nintendo greenlit the project. Throughout development, Velan Studios remained in close contact with both Nintendo's software and hardware teams, and the result was 2020's Mario Kart Live Home Circuit. The game received positive reviews and sold 1.7 million copies as of 2022, which is pretty impressive for a more niche entry like Home Circuit. And then finally, in 2022, Nintendo unveiled the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Booster Course Pass, a series of downloadable courses for Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Over the course of a year and a half, a whopping 48 courses were added to the game, bringing Mario Kart 8 Deluxe up to a total of 96 courses, far more than any other game in the series. The catch? These courses were all based heavily on pre-existing tracks from Mario Kart Tour. Tour isn't an ugly game, but its art style is rather incongruous with the look of Mario Kart 8. Still, Nintendo did put in work to polish up the tracks somewhat. Yabuki said, "The word remaster might sound cheap, but we're confident that it will create new and unique experiences that are different to how tracks were originally. We had to make all sorts of adjustments, as it wasn't enough to simply leave the tracks as they were." So, while the Nintendo Switch received no brand new mainline Mario Kart games, the series certainly wasn't dormant for those 8 years. But by 2025, it had finally become time for the next big game in this long-running series. Part 9: Mario Kart World. On the 16th of January 2025, after months of rumours, leaks and speculation, Nintendo finally unveiled their newest game console, the Switch 2. And as part of the first look trailer, a brief snippet of an unannounced new Mario Kart game was shown off. And when I say brief, it's about 15 seconds. But those 15 seconds were enough to set fans' imaginations running wild. The trailer showed off a new, more expressive art style, and more racers than could previously participate in a single race, 24. A few months later, Nintendo announced Mario Kart World, a truly next-generation Mario Kart game. In World, each of the game's courses are interconnected, forming a large, open world for players to race across. In fact, in Grand Prix mode, players actually drive from one track to the next. And with exciting new modes like Free Roam and Knockout Tour, mechanics like rail grinding and wall riding, and a huge roster of characters and costumes, Mario Kart World seems like the biggest Mario Kart game to date. Not biggest in terms of track number, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe will likely reign supreme on that count with its total of 96. But in terms of scope and raw ambition, this is the biggest. So, Super Mario Kart got its start in 1993 as a kind of experiment by a tiny team of just 8 people. Flash forward to 2025, when Mario Kart World is launching alongside Nintendo's brand new console, the Switch 2. And I wonder what that original development team would think if you showed them just how far their little creation would come in 30 years. Thanks very much for watching this big, long video about Mario Kart, and a huge thank you to my patrons for helping support videos like this one. In particular, thank you to Alison Withernall, Brett and Eric, Candy Crystal, Cyprian Eov, The Real Procyon, Daryl Jarrow, Ellie Birnbaum, Elise Rose Barsness, Eliza the Doe, Hi There and Bye, Jim Gilsonen, Kieran Chan, Kelly Wright, Lucas Little, Michael Gunter, Preston Kurth, Skate or Pie, Thomas Sutherland, and Tlazot Lalia.